Hello, this is my computer science fundamental project on CPUs, more particularly structure, function, and usage. So, let's get started. The application I would like to use as an example for others out there is Valorant. Since Valorant is one of the best games in all of history, it is on the high end of gaming technology, making it much more focused on CPU rather than GPU. Now, you're probably wondering, how does a CPU work? Well, I've decided to invite my good friend Jet here to explain it for us. Very well said, Jet. So, for those who didn't understand, Jet explains that it's actually quite complicated for non-gamers. A CPU has a complicated architecture used to accurately and effectively function, along with several different parts of a CPU related to the architecture that makes it run. So, we'll start with the parts.
You're terrible.
Very well said once again, Jet. So, it seems that we won't be able to do this alone, so I got the help of Sova, the Russian archer.
Hello.
Hello, Sova. So we have some questions for you.
Bruh.
What parts are there to a CPU? How does it work exactly?
My babushka told me not to brag,
Bruh.
but for this I make an exception.
That was a great speech, Sova. So, for those who once again, unfortunately, were not gamer enough to hear him, he says, quote, "So, there are many important parts to a CPU, such as arithmetic logic unit, instruction register and pointer, cache, memory management units, CPU clock and control unit, random access memory, supercharging and instruction cycle, and hyperthreading." So, let's start with the arithmetic logic unit. The ALU is a part of a CPU that performs the basic unit of math called arithmetic and logic functions that are the work of the computer. There are two registers, register A, register B. They hold input data while it's solved. The result is placed in the accumulator. The instruction register is exactly what it sounds like. It's the place where future instructions are kept for the CPU. The cache is a way faster way to give data to the CPU because the way that RAM gives data to a CPU is much slower than CPU computes it. So cache is a very efficient way to do it. So, in other words, it holds instructions and data and sends out faster than RAM would. The memory management unit manages data flow from RAM to CPU. And finally, the control unit is a component of a computer's central processing unit that directs the operation of the processor. So in other words, the control unit is the big boss. It does everything, like a carry in Valorant. So, now that we know how there are certain components for a CPU and the general idea of what a CPU is, it's time to get into the architecture of the CPU. So, this might be a very tough topic for Jet and Sova. So, this is my own personal idea. I decided to invite Yoru to join us this time to explain to us how CPU architecture works.
You made them look like idiots, Jet. You should do that again.
Alright, fantastically said, Yoru. So, in case you guys didn't hear him, he was talking about the random access memory. So the random access memory is where all of the memory is going. It gives all of the memory to the L2 and L3 cache as shown by the arrows. That's very important. And the memory management unit. So, then it goes to the L1 cache, and that memory goes to the instruction register and the instruction pointer. which both pretty much give instructions on how to solve the memory, I guess you could say, or like the arithmetic in this case. And that is when it goes to the arithmetic logic unit and it figures it out. Additionally, the L2 and L3 cache memory goes to L1D, which are the two registers, which, as explained before, are the two sections in which the arithmetic logic unit solves the memory. And although system clock, CPU clock, and control unit are not directly affiliated with the rest of the CPU, that does not mean that it is not included. The control unit, as explained before, is super important because it's the thing that gives all of the information and all the instructions to the rest of the CPU. Another thing worth mentioning is the accumulator, which is where all of the data sits and is sent out back to the application for it to use. So, for a quick summary, at its core, a CPU is given power by transistors placed all around the center, and takes instructions from a program or application and performs a calculation. This process breaks down into three key stages: fetch, decode, and execute. A CPU fetches the instruction from RAM, decodes what the instruction actually is, and then executes the instruction using the relevant parts of the CPU. The decoding process allows the CPU to determine what instructions need to be performed so that the CPU can tell how many operations it needs to fetch in order to perform the instruction. Then, during the execute process, the control unit of the CPU passes the decoded information as a sequence of control signals to the relevant function units of the CPU. So, this means that Valorant sends information to the CPU, and the CPU receives it, computes it, and executes it. The clock speed of whatever CPU you use greatly impacts how fast this process goes. Different parts of the CPU split off tasks to be able to do this in all such a quick time period. The faster the CPU clock speed, the better the performance of the computer and the better the gaming experience for the Valorant player is. However, Valorant is highly dependent on single-core processing speed. So this means it's important to take that into account, as this means multiple process cores aren't being used to run the game. Nowadays, it's easier to focus on how much can be done within a single clock speed rather than how fast it is. Clock speed measures the amount of time it takes for something to be calculated by the CPU. The control unit, which I explained before, is responsible for giving directions and operates what happens throughout the CPU. And the arithmetic logic unit, once again, is responsible for making calculations and is the primary and very important building block for the central unit. So, now that we've had plenty of different people explain to us various parts of a CPU, including its architecture, the various components inside one, it's time to finally actually discuss how Valorant communicates with your CPU to get you those sweet frames. So, it's actually quite simple. All that data and all that memory we were talking about this whole time is data and memory being sent by Valorant itself. I know, huge shocker. Valorant sends all of that over to the CPU for the CPU to solve and then send back immediately. All of that is done super quickly for you to be able to run your game as best and as fast as possible. So, next time you drop a 4K or an ace in your Valorant game, be sure to thank your CPU and, more importantly, me. Alright, thank you so much. Oh, yeah, before I go, I would just like to thank my friends Logan and Sion for letting me use their Valorant clips for the background, so that way you guys could see the true power of decent CPUs. But before I go, I have one more clip to show you that really exemplifies the power of a good CPU versus a bad one.
It's like the spikes. See? It's trying to deactivate it.
You should have seen your